Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. We are here to talk about the legacy of the former First Lady Rosalynn Carter, who died at 96 earlier this week. I'm here with David Greenberg, who is a professor of history, journalism, and media studies at Rutgers University. David, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So it strikes me when we reflect back on the First Lady's life, former First Lady's life, what a pioneer she was in that role. Am I right about that?
Well, in certain ways, I think so. In general, that role, there's no constitutional role for the First Lady. So, in a way, it's really what different women have made of the role. Eleanor Roosevelt, I think everybody knows, was really the first one to turn it into a substantive policy position, becoming really a public spokeswoman on all kinds of issues. But there were women before her who were influential upon their husbands, and who may even have had a thing or two to say about policy. And so I think Rosalynn is sort of in the pre Eleanor role in most ways. But one important thing I think where maybe the pioneer word does apply is in creating sort of the formal apparatus of the First Lady, what they call the East Wing. Before that, there wasn't, the same chief of staff, press secretary, the same huge staff. Now, some people would say, well, that's not feminism, that's just administrative bloat. And, we have seen a huge growth in general in White House personnel. That is not in any cabinet office, any agency, but the White House itself. Obviously, they literally don't all fit into the White House. But Rosalynn Carter was significant in that she really established that office of the First Lady as an office unto itself.
What about the fact that she allegedly joined cabinet meetings? And I probably shouldn't even use the word allegedly, but of course, we were not there. But was that unusual?
Yes, it was, and she did sit in on cabinet meetings. I think, if I'm not mistaken, also sometimes National Security Council meetings, and this raised eyebrows, drew some criticism. She wasn't really a participant in any way, from all accounts. She mostly kind of sat and observed, but it gave her the information and the knowledge to then, in conversation, of course, with her husband, to be informed about what his advisors were telling him and her own opinions. Now, the cabinet meetings by this point were already sort of on the decline, and we really don't hear about cabinet meetings much anymore. It's been a long-term decline in favor of, again, the White House staff, whether it's National Security Council on Foreign Policy or Domestic Policy Council. But nonetheless, she let it be known that she was going to be an influence on her husband and not stand on the sidelines.
Well, I think obviously one would assume that most partners of a president would be close advisors. I think what's interesting is when even the statement that the former president released regarding her being an equal partner in every way, is that something that has been welcomed in a First Lady, this idea that in essence you're getting two for the price of one?
Right, and that line, of course, with Bill Clinton's when he was campaigning in 1991 and 1992. The fact that it doesn't surprise us today that a First Lady would have an interest in policy, would talk to her husband, be an influence on policy. The fact that that doesn't surprise us is itself a historical development. 50 or 75 years ago, it probably would have been assumed that the wife stayed out of it altogether. And people
as was true in many other professions. Sorry, forgive me.
Right, exactly. No, that's exactly right. It was about a general attitude toward the role of women in society, and let alone that women hold these positions themselves, right? But, women, whether it was Florence Harding or Grace Coolidge or, even Bess Truman, they were intelligent, accomplished women in their own right who often had an influence. Be more publicly acknowledged, and women, whether it's Rosalynn, or I think, especially Hillary is the next one after Eleanor, who I think becomes kind of a major figure in that office. But yes, of course, it draws a backlash. It draws criticism. There are people who say this is not a constitutional or a legal role, so it's akin to nepotism. There are others where it's just a more traditional anti-feminist, opposition to women exerting that kind of influence. So I think, it took a lot to stand up and say, yes, this role, the public element of the First Lady's role, is being redefined, and that itself was significant.
I've certainly heard criticism, as we all have, of Jimmy Carter during his presidential time. I'd never hear much criticism about Rosalynn Carter in terms of her political instincts, her manner, the impact that she had.
Well, it's interesting, today we're looking back and talking about her as a pioneer, or someone who at least, pushed the boundaries. At the time, I think women and feminists were not altogether positive about her. I mean, she did get some criticism from what we might call the right, but she also got it from feminists on the left who felt she was too deferential, too much played the old-fashioned role the way, Pat Nixon more recently was known to have done. And we should probably give a shout out in between to Betty Ford, who in some ways was more important than Rosalynn Carter. She really, both with her drinking and with her breast cancer, went public with these, really became a very public figure in her own right. And after that, I think and this was, of course, the mid-'70s, kind of the heyday of feminism, or women's lib, as the term at the time was used. And so there were sort of expectations that, okay, here's a Democrat in office, no less, albeit a very conservative Democrat, but shouldn't the First Lady step up? So a lot of feminists were disappointed that she was not more outspoken, that she was a Southern traditionalist in many ways. She had a very reserved personality, so she couldn't be, sort of galvanizing to the public. She didn't have those gifts the way some politicians do. So there were criticisms, of course, from that perspective as well.
Her particular causes were mental health. I know she spoke a lot about the importance of care for caregivers. How important were those as issues? Or certainly she continued to talk about it long after her husband left office.
Yeah, I mean, she certainly, I think, gets credit for helping to put those issues on the national agenda, or at least you might say sort of shining a light on those issues. Obviously, there were people before her who were talking about them. And, it's always a challenge, I think, that First Ladies face when they pick an issue. And unfortunately, it's often been kind of, you get one that you're associated with. And it usually has to be an issue that is in some ways feminized, or, seems okay for women.
As a mother, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Exactly, right. It's rare for First Ladies to say, like, I'm going to look at, like, the readiness of our Navy or something like that. It's usually, I mean, they should, or they could, but, usually it's something, Michelle Obama did obesity and fitness, and, it often has to do with these kind of
Melania
caring.
Trump, yeah. Cyberbullying, right,
exactly.
I think, was Melania Trump, yeah.
Right, yeah. Didn't didn't go too far with that one, at least from her own family standpoint. But yes, so I think she played a role in spotlighting that issue, and as you say, in some ways, more importantly, afterwards, kept up with it, which suggested this was not a political stunt or a political fashion. This was a lifelong commitment. There were foundation. She said foundations for, or a foundation for, promoting awareness of mental health issues, for promoting solutions to difficulties. People late in life needing care. So it was part of a lifelong commitment, and in some ways, that is, I think, even more honorable than using those brief years in the White House to shine a light on it.
Let me circle back to her personality, and frankly her husband too. One of the things that has struck me in looking at many videos of her and just over the years hearing her speak was a certain fundamental kindness and a decency to the way she interacted, the way she thought about politics. I almost feel wistful in saying that, but was that unusual?
Well, look, I think the nation in the late 1970s is still coming out of Watergate and the Nixon years, and also Vietnam. And these were very contentious years, to put it mildly. I mean, look, much like our own, people who wouldn't talk to each other. We had the generation gap where young people felt one way about America, and older people felt another way. And then Nixon in the White House was, a very angry man. And he himself was a divisive personality. I mean, Ford was not. But I think the nation was kind of, it's hard to generalize about what was then maybe 200 million people, but there was a sense of being depleted, of being exhausted, of these partisanship, having gone too far, other divisions being too debilitating on the culture. So there was something about both Jimmy and Rosalynn coming in and trying to set a new tone. It wasn't perfectly successful. I mean, Jimmy Carter was an interesting personality. On the one hand, could be very, warm isn't the right word, but could be very positive minded about the United States and its people, and he stressed decency. He was also himself could be very prickly and impatient and short-tempered. So it doesn't mean there's a perfect overlap there. And I think Rosalynn too. The warmth, the positiveness, very much came through in her public persona. I think for some people, maybe the younger generation, there was less of a connection there. That she seemed more of a throwback to an earlier model of motherhood, wifehood, and she didn't become a symbol for women the way in our own time Hillary Clinton or even Michelle Obama has become really a symbol for a lot of people whose picture gets put up on walls or that kind of a thing.
Well, and then of course then came the Hollywood glamour of Nancy Reagan. So when we think about her, let's we go back to the long and rich life that this woman led. I know her husband is still in hospice at this point. How do you think Rosalynn Carter will be remembered?
Well, I do think, you talk about the long and rich life. It's also just astonishing to look at the length and success of their marriage. They
77 years.
77 years. I mean, that's got to approach some kind of a record. I don't know. Maybe it is a record for first couples, but even in human existence, that's quite quite astonishing. They were both from the same part of rural Georgia and grew up together. So there was, and they got together at a very young age. So there was something about the two of them together and their journey through life and into politics, and then this very, very long post-presidential career that I think, in some ways that will be a central part of how she's remembered, as someone who was really always there at Jimmy Carter's side his whole career. And, I think we're learning too, speaking as a historian, all public figures, all famous figures in history who are men, I shouldn't say all, but most, more than we think, are in fact quite reliant on their wives. Their wives are often deeply involved in their careers. They're thinking about things. I'm thinking of Coretta Scott King, particularly with the new Martin Luther King biography by Jonathan Ive, shows just how important she was. And it occurred to me, she has not had a proper biography. We see this with some other first ladies who are kind of retrospectively getting their due. And I think, more and more we will turn and discover this about women in a lot of different fields at a time when maybe the same career options weren't available to them because of sexism, because women weren't welcomed into many different professions in the same way. They took a role behind the scenes in shaping the careers of their husbands. And I think, it will be interesting. There have been some very good recent biographies of Jimmy Carter, but as we go forward, for historians to look more into precisely the role and the influence that she played in his career and his success.
Yeah. What's the old aphorism? Behind every man stands a great woman. I think one thing that certainly is remarkable that she stood to his side, and he was very open about that. So, David, thank you for joining us. We're talking about Rosalynn Carter, and appreciate your insights on her and also the other first ladies.
Glad to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.